Welcome to today's Expert Chat. I'm Ginny with the Understood team, and today we're going to be talking a bit about dyscalculia versus math anxiety. We're going to be comparing the signs, and our very special guest today is Professor Daniel Ansari. Professor Ansari is the Professor of Psychology at Western University in Canada. Welcome, Daniel. How are you today?
I'm good, Ginny. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Daniel, before we get started, can you tell our viewers a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist by training. I did my undergraduate in psychology, then a master's in neuroscience. Then I spent some time teaching in a faculty of education and developed a real interest about the intersection between psychology and education and neuroscience as well. My primary research focuses on the early development of children's number skills and understanding better why some children struggle with math. And in my research, I use both behavioral and brain imaging methods.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today, Daniel. And for our viewers, Daniel will be taking your questions throughout the chat. Please type them in the chat box, and we'll get to those questions as soon as we can. All right, and with that, we can get started, Daniel. The first thing I'd like to just mention is that it sounds like the relationship between math anxiety and dyscalculia is something like a chicken and egg situation. So hopefully today we'll be able to sort out the difference. So for starters, what are the signs of a true math disability? So what's the difference between a student who struggles in math and a student that a student that has a true math disability, like dyscalculia, or just a kid that finds math difficult? How do you distinguish the two?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, something that can be difficult to do. So you might have two children who you test on the same day, and both of them perform very poorly on a test of math. But then one of the children will go on to flourish in math, and the other one will continue to struggle in math. So in order to really differentiate children who might have a bad day or might struggle with a particular topic in math from those that have a more sort of persistent difficulty in math is really to look at children over time and to see who are those children who are able then to catch up from maybe struggling for whatever reason initially, and those who really have a persistent difficulty. So children who have what you might call a true math difficulty or dyscalculia are those who do not really respond to intervention in the same way as other students do, and who continue to lag behind despite attempts to help them understand problems in a better way. So it's really about looking at how they perform over time, and to distinguish those who maybe struggle at one time point from those who continually struggle. And those who continually struggle are really those for whom we might apply the term math disorder or dyscalculia.
Okay, great. So is there then no formal way to screen or diagnose dyscalculia?
Unfortunately, there is certainly no one way of doing so, and I think clinicians and educational psychologists across the world use a variety of different tools. At this point in time, most commonly what people use are standardized tests of math achievement, and you set off a cutoff point. You say, for example, children who have math difficulties are those who are 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. There is no other way of really doing it at this point in time, and compared to dyslexia, there is less work on sort of the underlying basic fundamental competencies that students with dyscalculia might be struggling with. So unfortunately, at this point in time, children with dyscalculia are mostly diagnosed on tests that measure what they do in school, so the school relevant math, and less on sort of the foundational competencies. But I think the times are changing, and in a few years we'll see more of those kinds of tests that are similar to the ones that are already being used to diagnose children with dyslexia or reading difficulties emerging in the field of math and dyscalculia.
Oh, that's good to know. So Daniel, what are those early skills that are difficult for a child with dyscalculia? What are some really early signs, some red flags?
Yeah, so I think one of the earliest signs of children who might go on to experience difficulty in math are children who have difficulty understanding quantity, so the number of items in the set, and then critically how quantity relates to symbols, such as number words or Arabic numerals. So understanding that symbol-quantity link appears to be something that children with dyscalculia struggle with. And importantly as well, children's understanding of the link between symbols and quantity also turns out to be a strong predictor of their later math abilities. So for example, children's ability to compare which of two numbers is numerically larger, or children's ability to match a set to a symbol. So for example, you've got two sets of apples, one is 5 apples, the other one is 6 apples, and then you've got the Arabic numeral 6, and the child has to choose which group of apples matches the symbol in terms of the number of apples in the set. That turns out to be something that is predictive of math difficulties. Another domain in which children with developmental dyscalculia often struggle is in spatial skills, in understanding spatial relations and mental rotation skills and spatial matching skills, being able to compose geometrical figures and decompose them as well. And we know that there is an intimate link between spatial cognition and mathematical cognition. So one of the reasons why children might develop math difficulties as well is because they have difficulties thinking spatially and understanding spatial relations as well. So there's the sort of the numeric quantitative aspect of things, and then there's also the spatial aspect of things that seems to those two things seem to be good predictors of later math difficulties, as well as later math strengths, of course.
Okay, sure. All right, so now let's move on to the anxiety piece, Daniel.
Yes.
So we know that anxiety impacts a student's working memory, so that can make it really hard for them to learn or even retain information. So here's where I think the chicken and egg problem comes in. Can dyscalculia be a function of math anxiety, or vice versa?
I think both can be true, and we are not really, I don't think we have a full understanding of that yet. So again, you could have two students who perform equivalently on a test of mathematics, and one of them, their performance can be explained by the anxiety. In the moment of having to take a math test, they get very nervous. They start to, have intrusive thoughts. I'm not good at this. I can't do this. I don't want to do this. This is not the way I want to spend my time. And then there's the other student who maybe has both, has math anxiety, but also has a fundamental cognitive limitation in their ability to do problems. So for example, in first grade, to be able to add and subtract because they don't yet understand what those symbols really mean, let alone what the operation of addition and subtraction is. So it is a chicken and egg problem. And most students with dyscalculia will experience math anxiety. Whether the math anxiety led to the math difficulties, or the math difficulties, the cognitive limitations, or the cognitive difficulties led to the math anxiety, that's rather unclear from the literature. But I think it's an example of having to take the connection between cognition and emotion really seriously. You know, we often think about these two things as being separable, but often they're deeply intertwined. I think from an educational point of view, I think this affords an opportunity to see whether you can work with students in lessening their math anxiety, whether that will also affect their math performance. And there will probably be some for whom lessening the anxiety is really the key to unlocking their potential for mathematical success, whilst for other students, even with lessening the anxiety, there's still some cognitive limitations that have to be dealt with, that have to be looked at. So I think the important take home here is that we're not clear what the chicken and egg is, but we are very clear that there is a deep intrinsic connection between the two, and that's something that we need to be aware of when we work with students who have math difficulties.
Okay, excellent. So Daniel, then, what are your feelings about timed tests, minute math? These sort of tests tend to bring anxiety to kids who struggle, maybe even kids that don't struggle. Do you have a feeling about that?
Yeah, so I think that's a very complicated and hotly debated question. So I think first of all, it's important to say that not all time tests are the same. You know, you can have high stakes and low stakes time testing. So you can have time tests that really affect a grade, or time tests that are just part of practicing problems and developing fluency in situations where there's no high stakes associated with completing a certain number of problems in a certain amount of time. In general, general, I think in order to encode information into long-term memory and to be able to retrieve it efficiently, some time component can be useful, but one needs to be very careful under which circumstances one administers time tests, whether it's in a high stakes or a low stakes environment. So I think retrieval practice, the sort of testing in order to deepen knowledge and to deepen understanding, is really important and should be done sometimes in time situations. One also needs to make sure that there is enough spacing between different time tests. Research has shown that even children with math difficulties, research by Lynn Fuchs and others at Vanderbilt University, has shown that students with math difficulties do benefit from having some time components be part of a remediation program. The connection between time tests and math anxiety, again, is a complex one. I think many people think that time tests cause math anxiety, but there is actually no research to suggest that that's necessarily true. I think, again, it depends on the stakes, on the context within which this time testing occurs. I do think that timing can be an important part of building fluency and building efficient retrieval of facts from memory in math.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go to some viewer questions now, Daniel. We have several. All right, so Minnow is looking for suggestions to work with her students with dyscalculia and math anxiety within the regular classroom setting. These students are getting services, and she appears to be working with a co-teaching model. So what strategies do you have for this teacher?
What grade level was this again? Did you say?
You know what? Unfortunately, we don't have a grade level here. Minnow, if you'd like to, I can ask the viewer to quickly type it in, and we can get back to it.
Sure.
Would that be okay, Daniel?
Sure. I can just start speaking more broadly without reference to a specific grade level.
Okay, great.
I think in terms of strategies for students with dyscalculia, is trying to understand what are some of the barriers to their learning. You know, is it that they don't have an understanding of the symbol quantity relationship, for example? If that is the case, then you need to work on that. Is it the way that problems are presented sometimes? Maybe there is a problem in actually being able to understand what they're being asked. So sometimes that's the case when you have word problems. Right? It can be hard for students to, if they have other challenges, maybe they have reading difficulties, and often students with dyscalculia also have reading difficulties. Is it that they're being unable to extract the relevant information in order to solve the problem because it is a word problem? Do they have metacognitive problems? So sometimes students are being asked to explain their work, and metacognition refers to the ability to sort of introspect on your own thinking, to say, you know, in this situation I did this because I thought this might be useful. So you're sort of talking about your own thinking. And sometimes students in math classrooms are being asked to explain their work. So maybe they can do the problem, but they can't explain their work because they have metacognitive problems. So I think it's a little bit, as with any learning challenge, it's a little bit of a sort of detective work where you try to understand exactly what are the barriers to their learning. You know, that's the first step. And then giving them more time and giving them more opportunities, maybe after school as well, to participate in some math remediation programs, making sure that the context isn't anxiety provoking as well, because that would just compound the problem. So those are some simple steps that I can think of. It really depends on where the specific difficulty lies.
Right. Okay, great. Another question from Kath. She has a grade 6 daughter who's struggling with applying early math concepts, number concepts. How can they help her? How can they help this grade 6 child? So she must be in middle school, Daniel.
Yeah. So that's a question that I get often, and it's a really difficult question to answer. So because math is so cumulative, you know, the early foundations that you build really serve as the springboard for all other mathematical abilities that you might develop and that you might be taught in school. So how to catch up is a really difficult thing, because you don't want to also give students who are in grade 6 problems that are appropriate for grade 1 students. But I think some at home, some way of going back and again doing that detective work of seeing at what kind of foundational skills are lacking that you need in order to do the grade basics work is really important. I think there's many programs around that this teacher or this parent might be able to use in order to maybe go back a few grade levels and rehearse some of the material and think about, what are the critical skills that the student needs at this grade level. It's very, very hard for me to recommend any sort of specific strategies because, again, it is this sort of unforgiving thing in math, is that it is so cumulative, right? And that the early foundations play such a critical role, and that going back can be very difficult and can be, also some students find that embarrassing to go back to earlier grade levels and to sort of admit to themselves and their parents that they didn't quite get it then, and therefore they can't apply it now.
Right. Yes, it's a dilemma. Yes. All right. Thank you, Daniel. All right. Nancy wants to learn more about the signs of dyscalculia versus dyslexia. So, let's talk about overlap and even incidence, Daniel.
Yeah. So, in terms of the incidence, I think there are fewer population-based studies of dyscalculia than there are of dyslexia, but it's around the same incidence. It's between 5 and 7% of the population. And critically, that also depends, again, on how you define dyscalculia, because you always take a normal distribution and you set off some cutoff point, and that's how you then define who has dyscalculia or not. There is a lot of overlap between dyscalculia and dyslexia, but they are also distinct from one another. So in terms of sort of the warning signs in dyscalculia is early on an inability to connect symbols to quantities, to deal with the most fundamental aspects of cardinality, understanding that, when you count, the purpose of counting is to enumerate sets, and that the last number in count sequence represents the total number of items in the set. A difficulty of mapping number into space. So when you work with number lines, students with dyscalculia might struggle with estimating the position of a number on a number line, let's say from 0 to 10 or from 0 to 100. Children with dyscalculia also sometimes have difficulties in understanding ordinal relationships between numbers. So if you present them with a sequence of 3 numbers and you ask them, are they in order or not, that might be a concept that they have difficulties understanding. Symbol quantity relationships, I think, is really important. And then looking as well, as I said, in answer to your first question, looking at the spatial domain as well and seeing whether they're struggling with spatial skills as well. So I think those are some of the early warning signs of dyscalculia. But yes, many students with dyscalculia also have dyslexia, and there, going back to one of the previous questions, it's really important to understand when does the reading difficulty interfere with the math learning. If you have word problems, for example, might students be struggling not so much with the math component of the word problems, but just by passing, being able to comprehend the problem when it's written on a page.
Okay, very good. All right, Daniel, we have an interesting question, definitely one for you. Dyslexia is due to a deficit in phonological processing, right? So LP wants to know, why is it that kids with dyslexia could have problems remembering math facts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that might partly have to do with the phonological difficulties that they have, because one theory of how we represent math facts in our long-term memory is that phonological skills play a role here, that it's sort of a verbal code within which we store our math facts. So therefore, being able to retrieve math facts requires some phonological representations to be intact. And if those are, affected in dyslexia, you might find that they have math fact retrieval and encoding difficulties. From a neuroscience perspective, the areas that are involved in math fact retrieval are very similar to the areas that are involved in phonological processing skills. So there seems to be some neural overlap there as well between phonology and math fact. So, for example, in the left temporoparietal cortex, you see activation when people are doing, for example, a rhyming task, which involves phonological awareness. Being able to rhyme involves phonological awareness, but those areas are also activated when people are retrieving math facts. And similar white matter tracts seem to be involved in phonological processing as well as in math fact retrieval. So that might explain why children with dyslexia some of them experience difficulties in encoding and retrieving math facts.
That is really interesting. Thank you. Okay, great question. Thank you so much.
Yes, great.
And just to follow up on that, ST has a sixth grader who has a son who can't remember multiplication tables. She's tried reviewing them verbally, flashcards, using manipulatives, playing games. Any other suggestions, Daniel?
Those are some of the methods that I would have recommended as well. It's difficult how to do it at that grade level to go back. I would suggest maybe also going and looking for apps that might be useful. I know there's hundreds and thousands of educational apps, but there are some apps specifically designed for building a better knowledge and representation of math facts. So that might be something she might look at as well. But some students just really struggle greatly with encoding math facts into long-term memory, and then also maybe trying to think less about can we get to a level with this student where they know all their math facts, to can we get to a level where they can use compensatory strategies. So developing their fluency with algorithms to multiply, for example, could be a useful way as well.
Okay. All right. Now we have a question from Poppy, who says that her child can't do math facts, struggles with math processes. She allows him to use a calculator to do math facts, but works to assist him in understanding the processes. So she's thinking that the processes are more important. Do you agree with her approach? She also includes that her son's anxiety is very high when it comes to homework, and it does impact his enjoyment at school. So is she okay with using the calculator approach and then supplementing that with, I guess, some more conceptual understandings of math?
Yeah, I think the important point is here that she's clearly really thought about what the use of a calculator implies and how to mitigate some of the risks of using calculators, which is just to sort of blindly type in the numbers and the operations without knowing what they mean. So as long as the student is getting opportunities to, at the same time, develop their conceptual understanding of math, I think then it's probably a good strategy rather than going through the frustrating exercise of trying to get the student to do something that, they might have some limitation in being able to develop a long-term memory for facts. And you don't want that anxiety to sort of take over the enjoyment of doing math or the potential fascination with the conceptual aspects of math. So intuitively, to me, this makes a lot of sense. And what I admire about this approach is that it's reflective, right? This parent has clearly thought about how calculators might be used as a compensatory strategy, not just as something that you just use blindly.
Okay, great. And Daniel also, and viewers, one thing I wanted to mention, Daniel's last response about math apps, I did want to chime in with that. We have a wonderful tech finder on the Understood site. So if you go to u.org/techfinder, you can find many math apps that might be very useful for helping your child remember math facts. So, thank you, Daniel, for bringing that up, and please check out TechFinder.
Yeah, I'm going to check it out myself.
Thank you. Great. Okay, Jill has a question. How do you help a second grader who still has trouble making one-to-one correspondence when counting items? This was first noticeable in kindergarten. It's improved, but is still not fully resolved. So first, Daniel, if you'd explain what one-to-one correspondence is, and then talk about what can be done maybe to help this child establish a stronger foundation with that skill.
Yeah. So one-to-one correspondence is one of the counting principles, is that each number word that you utter corresponds to one and only one object in a set. So it's related to order in that as well. This is the first set in the count sequence, the second item of the set in the count sequence, the third item, and so forth. So it's really about connecting number words one-on-one to objects in a set. One-to-one correspondence can also extend to understanding the quantitative relationship between two sets. So it relates to the classic Piagetian conservation task. You could have, 2 rows of 7 coins, and help students understand that they are the same set and that there's a one-to-one correspondence between each and every item in a set. I think in order to help students understand one-to-one correspondence better is to use a sort of gradual abstraction principle, where initially you use, for example, 2 rows of items, and the items in the 2 rows are identical. So let's say they're all coins, and then you go to more abstract relationships. So you go to 7 apples and 7 oranges, or to 7 objects that each object is of a different kind in both of the rows. But what is the equivalence between the two sets, the one-to-one correspondence between the two sets, is by the number word that attaches to each item in the set. So if you've got, for example, 1 to 3 objects, you've got an orange, an apple, and a pear, and in the other set you've got a car key, a coin, and a flower. The number word 3 applies to the last object in the count sequence equally in both sets. So that's how to get more and more abstract with one-to-one correspondence. So those are some ways I can think of that you might help students gradually develop an abstract understanding of one-to-one correspondence.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time just for one more question, Daniel. So this question, actually there are 2 questions from Lauren that are related. She would like to know more about the relationship, or if there's a relationship, between issues with visual processing and dyscalculia, and also the effect of dyscalculia on math fact fluency.
Okay. So maybe I'll start with the first one, the last question, which is the effect of dyscalculia on math fact fluency. So the way that I think most researchers think about it today is that students initially need to develop a good understanding of quantity and the relationship between symbols and quantity, and that's essential for them to build math facts. So if they lack that understanding, if they lack an understanding of how, let's say, the symbol 3, the digit 3, or the number word 3 refers to 3 sets, how are they then going to use that understanding in order to develop math facts? So I think that at the core of math fact difficulties lies a difficulty in understanding quantity. I think that's the answer to the last question. And the first question is a really interesting one, and I think one where we don't fully understand yet what the specific relationship is between visual problems and dyscalculia. Certainly it's true that all of the research that we do, or the majority of the research that we do, is we look at how children process numbers through the visual modality. We present them with problems in a written format or with manipulative, and very rarely do we use the auditory modality in order to test their understanding. So I think I don't have a full answer to this question, because we simply don't know yet. I think we do know that there is an association between visual spatial processing and math, but I think the question is more about visual perception and how visual perception impacts math learning. And I don't think we have a good understanding of that yet. We do know from research with blind participants that they seem to be having no difficulties in acquiring mathematical skills that are taught through the sensory motor and auditory modalities. So from those case studies, there's certainly no reason to suggest that vision is essential to developing mathematical knowledge. It doesn't seem to be the case.
Okay. And Daniel, I know in many cases you say that we don't have answers yet, and it is true that we are so far behind compared to dyslexia research with research on dyscalculia. Is that true?
I think that's true. I think the field is catching up. I think research on math learning difficulties has really increased over the past 2 decades. But the difference as well between reading and math is that I think the upper level of complexity is so much greater. There's so many different aspects to math learning. You talk about, early number development, early number sense. You talk about geometry, then you talk about algebra, you talk about statistics. There's so many more questions to answer. But I think we are catching up, and thankfully, thanks to organizations such as yours as well, I think awareness is growing that issues can exist in math learning, and that we need to develop better strategies to deal with it.
Okay. And of course, Daniel, I want to thank you for all the research you're doing in this field. You are just doing amazing work. So thank you for that, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to chat.
Okay, it's always great, Daniel. And for our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today. If you've missed any portion of this chat, or you'd like to watch it again, know that we archive all of our chats at u.org/calendar. And if you have any further questions, please join the Understood community at u.org/community. You'll find parents and experts talking about issues that may be similar to your own. Thank you once again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.